Thank you very much for inviting me to present our research. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be with you live today, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions over email if you are happy to provide your details and your question to the chairs. So I will be presenting some emerging findings from the Early Development in Tuberous Sclerosis, or EDIT study, which is funded by the Tuberous Sclerosis Association and is aiming to identify predictors of later behavioural outcomes in infants with TSC. So a large proportion of individuals with TSC will experience TSC-associated neuropsychiatric disorders, or TAND, which is an umbrella term that's been used to describe the multi-level variety of the neuropsychiatric manifestations of TSC. In our research on infants, we're largely focusing on the left-hand side of the umbrella at the moment, looking at different behaviours that emerge in early childhood, as well as potential neuropsychiatric disorders such as autism and ADHD and intellectual disability. But of course, as the infants grow older, we'll be able to examine more about the academic, psychosocial, and neuropsychological level. Importantly, these different levels are not mutually exclusive, and different features will co-occur in the same individual. Despite the large proportion of individuals that experience TAND, research from the UK TSA has suggested that only around 20% of individuals with TSC will receive assessment or treatment related to TAND. And this is particularly concerning because we know that the behavioural and cognitive difficulties associated with TSC are major determinants of quality of life for individuals and their families. And we know that the combination of having behavioural difficulties and a lack of help and support for these difficulties significantly predict the burden and impact of TSC. So it's important that we try and understand what the correlates and predictors of TAND features are in TSC, so we can try and improve these outcomes and improve quality of life. So within focusing in on autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, researchers suggested that around 50% of individuals with TSC will receive a diagnosis of ASD, which is higher than the general population prevalence of around 1%. But also we know that around 50% won't receive a diagnosis. And it's this variability in outcome that might help us to pinpoint different risk and resilience factors for diagnosis of ASD. So there has been some research suggesting that there are clinical features that are correlated with autism, including the presence of intellectual disability, having a TSC2 mutation, the number and location of cortical tubers, and also certain features of epilepsy, such as lower age at seizure onset and certain types and severity of seizures, particularly early in life in the first 2 years. However, the majority of studies so far have been quite small, uncontrolled, and retrospective. And we know that there's no single clinical feature that's necessary or sufficient for the diagnosis of ASD. And it's more likely that these different clinical features interact over time and development on the pathway to autism. We also know that a lot of studies so far haven't used methods that are able to capture the social and attentional difficulties that we know are characteristic of ASD. While we know that the early years are particularly important for understanding different behavioural outcomes in TSC, the majority of studies have asked parents to try and remember what their child was like in the early years once a diagnosis of autism has already been established, which in the UK is around 3 or above. However, parents tend to recall some concerns earlier than this. And also we know that very early in life, the brain is undergoing a period of very rapid and complex development that ultimately will lead to the emergence of different behaviours. And in TSC, the resulting changes to synaptic function from the genetic mutation through to brain development and behaviour will necessitate a study of brain development very early in life. So it's important that we conduct a prospective measurement of development prior to the emergence of autism. And we have this opportunity in TSC because it's often diagnosed in early infancy or in utero. And by doing so, this will help us to identify if there are any early predictors of later behavioural outcomes like autism, and ultimately to inform early intervention to improve longer term outcomes. And this sort of prospective design has been used for several years in studies of infant siblings who have an older brother or sister who has a diagnosis of autism. And these have an elevated likelihood of receiving a diagnosis of autism themselves at around 20%. So my collaborators in the BASIS and STARS teams, that's based at Birkbeck in London, their design and protocol can inform the design and protocol used for prospective studies of TSC. And that brings me on to the early development in tuberous sclerosis, or EDIT study, in which we've been recruiting infants with TSC very early in life and following their development at multiple time points throughout the first 2 years. We selected these time points based on these other infant sibling studies to enable a comparison, and added in additional time points at 3 and 8 and 18 months so that we could capture sudden changes in the severity of epilepsy and treatment for epilepsy. We've been conducting all assessments in the family home. This is to reduce burden on families who already have multiple clinical assessments to attend, and also to increase the familiarity of the environment for the baby. And also with technological advances, we can now administer not only behavioural assessments, but also neurocognitive assessments in the family home. So we're doing kind of observational measures in addition to eye tracking and some EEG. And I'll talk a bit more about the eye tracking in a second. So we're using a protocol that's synergistic to these other infant sibling ongoing studies. And this will allow us to see whether there are any pathways that converge across these different causes of autism, or if indeed there are perhaps the subtypes. So we have been recruiting infants with TSC either during pregnancy or up to 14 months of age through the TSA and a UK-wide network of clinics. And we have recruited over 2/3 of infants with TSC under 6 months of age, which will be important to track the effect of early seizure severity. This table here shows our recruitment. So we have 32 infants with TSC and 28 typically, or TD, typically developing controls. And we have 100% retention in the study at 24 months of age. So these numbers show quite different across ages, just showing where infants were enrolled into the study. We still have a few visits to complete, and we'll complete these in spring or summer, early summer next year. And we've completed over 330 visits in total across the UK in the family home. So I move on to talk about some of the emerging findings from this study. And just to note, this is based on a slightly smaller subset of the sample. So firstly, we're interested in development over infancy and early toddlerhood in infants with TSC. And we've been using a standardized assessment, which is administered by a trained researcher called the Mullen Scales of Early Learning. And this graph is showing non-verbal development over time from 3 to 18 months. And non-verbal development covers things like fine motor and visual reception skills. And what we can see here is quite a striking change and difference in the rate of development in infants with TSC versus typically developing controls, where from 5 months of age, we're seeing a divergence in non-verbal development. We ran a statistical model called a linear mixed model, which showed that there was a significant difference in the rate of change over time. So this kind of slope in development or developmental trajectory. And these group differences are apparent from 3 through to 14 months. And between 14 and 18 months, they seem to become more similar. And with verbal development, so tapping into expressive and receptive language, we see a very similar pattern with significant differences emerging from 5 months of age and a different slope or change in development in TSC right through to 8 months. And these findings suggest that the first year of life is particularly important for understanding changes in development in TSC, and that from very early, there is, from 5 months of age, there is this developmental lag, and this can point us towards an ideal window of opportunity for intervention. Abby Runnacles, who is a medical student at St. George's, has been looking into a more detailed analysis of this data and its interaction with epilepsy severity. So we've been collecting details about epilepsy at each time point using a measure called the E-CHESS, adapted for this population, which has been used in several previous studies of TSC, where we combine parent report, seizure diaries, and medical records to create an overall seizure severity score that captures different aspects, including the number of medications an infant is taking, the different types of seizures, and their response to medication. Abby's work has suggested that the epilepsy severity appears to peak around 8 months of age, which might reflect changes in managing the seizure medication very early in life. Importantly, epilepsy severity in the first year of life predicts this change in cognitive development that I just mentioned over time, and also predicts autistic traits from 18 months. But epilepsy severity in the second year of life is not significantly predictive. So this again suggests that the first year of life is particularly important for understanding these outcomes. And because there is this overlap between epilepsy and autism, it might suggest that there might be a shared underlying neurobiological mechanism between the two conditions. And this is something that we'll be examining more in a new study of infants with epilepsy called the B study, so watch this space. And moving on to our more objective measures of development, neurocognition, I thought I'd just spend some time talking about one of our eye tracking tasks called the gap overlap task. So we're able to set up an eye tracker in the family home in a tent to minimize distractions. And the eye tracker uses infrared cameras to track where a baby is looking on the screen before they're able to press a button or speak. And in this task, the baby focuses on a central stimulus and has to shift their attention to the peripheral stimulus. And we're interested in how quickly they're able to shift their attention in different conditions. For example, when the central stimulus stays up on the screen. And indeed, in the studies of infant siblings that I mentioned, this disengagement effect, so being able to disengage their attention from the central to the peripheral stimulus, is associated with later diagnosis of autism. So we wanted to see if we'd see anything similar in infants with TSC. And we found some really interesting results in our preliminary data. So again, this graph is showing change in this disengagement effect, so switching from the central to the peripheral stimulus over time from 3 to 18 months. And in our typically developing controls, we see a standard, what we'd expect, decrease in reaction times. They're getting quicker at shifting their attention. Our statistical analyses suggested there was a main effective group over time. So the infants with TSC are taking longer to disengage their attention across development, in early development, but also an interaction between group and time. So there is a significant difference in the change in reaction time between 3 and 10 months of age. And then the TSC group seemed to start back on the path declining in their reaction time. Importantly, the disengagement effect at 10 months of age predicts later emerging autistic traits at 18 months. So this could suggest that this is an objective marker in infancy that's predicting later development. So the findings so far suggest that atypical developmental trajectories, so this difference in the slope of change in the first year of life, predict neurodevelopmental impairment in early toddlerhood, so at the moment up to 18 months. And this might help us to identify infants who have a higher likelihood of having different behavioural outcomes later on, and ultimately inform early intervention in terms of using more objective measures to look at the effectiveness of intervention and seeing if there are any new targets for intervention as well. But really, in order to move further along this pipeline, we need to study development into later toddlerhood and the preschool years. So we have recently received funding to do just this, to follow up the EDITS cohort into the preschool years and gather information on key behavioural outcomes, including autism, emerging ADHD symptoms, and cognitive ability, and collecting more information about certain neuropsychological features such as executive function, and also sleep difficulties and school readiness, so tapping into academic skills. Importantly, we can use the data we've collected so far with the EDITS cohort to see if there are any predictors very early in life of outcomes at the preschool age. We'll be enrolling 3 to 5-year-olds with TSC from spring next year, so do get in touch if you are interested. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you to our participants and their families, without which this research would not be possible. to our funders, particularly the Tuberous Sclerosis Association, and everyone who has worked on this study. Thank you.